I think that most of you will have heard that, unfortunately, one of our big, not only supporters, but also our big brains of what's happening today and the history that we are talking about was Dr. Jack Ford. And he unfortunately died only 6 weeks ago, end of June. But it was now already 2 months ago. And so it's, that was, you know, an enormous setback, yeah? Of course, not only for Brenda, his wife, and for Leila, their daughter, but, you know, for all of us. It's an enormous loss that we have. He has such an enormous wealth of information, and also he was so happy to share that with us. Yeah? That was another fantastic element. So part of the exhibition, as we are having it there, is part of Jack's collection. Photographs that we are using were already allocated for display by Jack before he died, so we talked about him. Of course he was on the program, but that, of course, this didn't happen. So yeah, it was with big sadness that this happened. And then, of course, we had a symposium, and we did want to bring Jack in the symposium, but at the same time, of course, you can understand how difficult it was to, you know, for Brenda and for Leila to be involved in that you know, situation where they were grieving and we were grieving, of course, as well. And nevertheless, you know, we got their full support of both Brenda and Leila. And two things are happening. One is the exhibition, and the second thing, and I was so happy that I was able to talk to tell Jack that 2 days before he died, that we had a publisher for the republishing of his book. Yeah. So I was very happy that in any case he, you know, I got that information to just a couple of days before he died. So that's a project that's going to happen, and Leila, Jack's daughter, is going to talk to the publisher, Marcus Fielding in Melbourne, who was supposed to be here but unfortunately couldn't be here. So that's another nice next project that's happening. But I would like to invite Neville Buch to say a few words about Jack and, you know, how much we miss him. Neville.
Thanks very much. I would add Jack's acknowledgement and my acknowledgement to the traditional owners, and our acknowledgement too to the dignitaries that have been so supportive of this project and the symposium, dignitaries from Australia, the United States, and of course the Netherlands. And thank you, Paul. And also I acknowledge Brenda, Jack's widow, and Leila, his daughter. Jack was my mate, to put it in an Australian colloquial term. I knew Jack all through our history career, which began, I suppose, formally at Jack receiving his doctorate and I receiving my doctorate, and about a dozen historians at this university receiving their doctorate in 1995, which was the biggest cohort of history PhDs at this university, and sadly, of course, the numbers have declined over the decades. Jack was a military historian, but I was an intellectual historian, both an Australian intellectual historian and a global intellectual historian. And in terms of the time that I spent with Jack at his home in Northgate, we would have these incredible, deep conversations around the big picture of war and peace, that was the extraordinary thing in my friendship with Jack, which will be with me for the rest of my days, and I'm trying not to cry, because those who are for peace, those who are necessarily involved in war, are compatible, and that's been a centerpiece of my publications and writing, is the fact that, as opposed to the politicians, the bureaucrats and other creatures that try and divide us, we're actually quite compatible in the way that we think and in the world that we want. And that was the type of conversations that Jack, as a military historian, I, as an intellectual historian with a great concern for the peace movements, were able to have that conversation, and I think we were all better for it. Just a few details in terms of taking it a little bit beyond the personal to the details, a few details of Jack's life. He had a diploma of teaching from 1978 from Capricornia. Also from Capricornia, he got his Bachelor of Arts in 1981. He had to do a MA Qual in order to do his PhD, and he did that at this university in 1984. And as I've already mentioned, he, with his colleagues and friends, got his PhD in 1995. The title of that PhD was Allies in the Bind. He, as was the economic conditions in this country and around the world, wasn't able to really advance that area of work at that time, and he became a Brisbane City Council historian and worked in the Brisbane City Council for more than a decade. He also, like myself, after, and because of the economic conditions, I might add, became a private history consultant. Now his PhD and the book, of course, is Allies in the Bind, and that's the reason why I am giving this short eulogy in his honour, and I will be giving a paper tomorrow to exegete that work, Allies in Bind. So I would like to dedicate my participation, and I'm sure the participation of a number of people that are here today in this symposium, to Brenda, Leela, and in memory of Jack. Thank you. Good morning, and thank you very much. Thank you, Paul, for this. I make acknowledgements again of the dignitaries, in this case the Ambassador and the Colonel, but also Brenda and Leela, and everyone in this room. We're all dignitaries, because this has been such a dignified symposium, and I am so enriched and learnt so much from everyone's dignity in the room. So thank you very much. It's an honour to speak to you, but sadly on behalf of Jack. But also, I suppose my presentation is a synergy of Jack and myself. It's a springboard from the eulogy that I gave yesterday. Now, compared to yesterday, yesterday was very technical in military history. The presentation that I'm going to be giving is abstract but technical in policy, politics and sociology. And I suppose I'm actually going to, it is in some sense a form of a conversation with the ambassador and the colonel in that regard. So I'm looking forward to some questions on this. You've been notified. But I don't want to lose the rest of the audience. So that I'm going to actually, against what I had originally planned, I'm going to be hopefully very quick. I'm going to, with each of the slides, there are brief statements, and I'm just going to really pick out some phrases for everyone to think about, and then perhaps we can discuss that during our Q&A. But to start with, there are two terms that you need to understand. Exegete. Any biblical scholars amongst us? Exegete means to take a text and take it apart for each of the passage and to try and to understand what a particular passage within a text is saying. So my presentation is an exegete of Jack's book, Allies in a Bind. That's the first term. The other term is hermeneutics. Again, the second term that comes out of biblical studies. And hermeneutics is really just a fancy term for interpretation, but its more specific meaning is to draw out the rules of framing or the rules of interpretation. And in this case, we are looking at rules of the European framing, and more precisely, of course, the Dutch worldview, the Dutch outlook, as it was, and the previous speaker, of course, has spoken eloquently about that Dutch outlook in the period. Okay. So I must thank Professor Peters because she clarified for me what's called the 4M concepts, and this is about Dutch-Australian historiography in terms of the relationship. And the ambassador yesterday actually referred to the marker year of 1606, to which, if the Australians amongst us remember in our primary school education, was to do with the age of exploration in Australia. So the Dutch connection with Australia is very much around maritime exploration. The second M is military, third M is migration, and the fourth link is mercantile links. So, and we've covered all that yesterday, if you weren't aware, in terms of within the technical talk that was going on. All of that was covered. Now, I'm hoping here to evoke the spirit of Jack, because this is what Jack was talking about in his book, Allies in the Bind. I'm not going to go to a lot of some of the details or references in the book, which really have been covered in what's been said yesterday in terms of military operations, which Jack talks about in the book. So, you know, we've already talked about Brisbane as the major submarine centre hub during the Pacific War. So, as I said in the eulogy yesterday, this comes out, certainly out of the further research that I did in terms of exegeting through the book, but it also comes as a personal sort of narrative around the relationship that I had with Jack. And as I had said in the eulogy, he was the military historian, I was the Australian intellectual historian, and I was engaged with Jack because Jack's book was not simply military operations, it was about Australian foreign affairs and military strategy and the relationship between the two. And our thinking in some sense was a basic agreement in terms of the way that we saw that period. I think that our particular concerns, our historiographical concerns at that time, was that a lot of military history didn't really sort of appreciate that big picture view and how strategy, policy in some ways connected to the operations. So what the Allies in Blind is really about is a synergy of the diplomatic, the political and the military. And the work is a framework of comprehension, to be able to, in some sense, give people that big picture on everything that we've been talking about in the last 2 days. The book, also in terms of the synergy, was also around the objective sort of structural thinking, but also around the personalities and looking at the connection there. So that General MacArthur is a particular figure in the book, inescapably so. And I think the main point that sort of Jack is making is that the Australians had their war objectives, the Americans had their war objectives, the Dutch had their war objectives, and we heard a little more about that earlier. And in that mix was also personalities, the personalities of MacArthur, and many of, pretty well most of you I think would know about the reputation, the profile in Australian minds of MacArthur in terms of, you know, the stories around the type of person he was. Heard yesterday that he had formed his own particular intelligence unit, you know, and so there is a particular personal approach, but also a structural type of thinking that brought things together. And in terms of cognition, we call it control. And so a lot of the tensions in the playing out of the policy was around how the players thought about control in the narrative that was called the defence of Australia. So, what Jack's book particularly discusses is different players that were involved. On the Dutch side, Van Wolk and Van der Plas. But on the Australian side, it was around the policy decisions of the Foreign Minister or the Minister for External Affairs, Everett, and the Prime Minister, Ben Chifrey. And in that, and it's already been mentioned, is, I think, probably the central point that's been made is around what I would phrase as the big power versus small power syndrome. So that, as we said before, the Dutch East Indies, Australia, there was an awareness that we were small powers, where big players really sort of pulled the strings on the geopolitics in terms of, you know, the United Kingdom and the United States. So, the defence of Australia policy, and if we go back to the map, has been mentioned a few times in the symposium, is that what was perceived and what was thought about was a fear around the invasion of Australia, and that's also sort of, in historiographical terms, was layered because, you know, that fear of the invasion of Australia was something that went back to the late 19th century, you know, the fear of the Russians invading Australia. So, and then of course, as been said too, there had been for a long time in the early 20th century a fear around the Japanese. And so that sort of formed this view of the defence of Australia. But as we subsequently have found out from research that Humphrey McQueen in the 1980s brought out when he went over to Japan, he was able to go back into the documents and he was able to find out that that was not the Japanese intention. But nevertheless, my argument and what Jack has written about is about mindset. How people, the players at the time, thought. So this is my exegesis of Jack's book. Was to, in some ways, to look at each of the passages that he had written and realise that there was a cognitive rationalisation that was going on, to which it always goes on, you know, goes on in government, goes on in politics, diplomacy, but it also goes on, and I think this is where those that are engaged in different, very small areas within this bigger story have to understand is that continually the dynamic in thinking about Pacific operations, Pacific processes are always linked into a bigger story, and there's a lot of political power play that is going on in that process. So So the question has to be, what is the particular rationalisation that was going on for the Dutch government in exile in Brisbane at the time? And this, I would suggest, goes to the first chapter title of Jack's book, which was Duping the Dutch. So this is important. Why is this important? Well, because what Jack wrote about was that there was a popular trend amongst post-war Australian veterans to blame the Dutch for the collapse of resistance in Europe and Southeast Asia, which was quite unfair, but it came from what I would argue was a doctrine of Americanism in a particular political outlook within the American story. And it's something that I'm very familiar with and fairly expertise, because my PhD was on American influence on Protestantism, Protestant thinking in Queensland from 1945 to about 1985. And there's been many Australian historians that have discussed about the influence of Americanisms in Australia and the influence in terms of ways of thinking. Now I will quote Jack. The political aspects of the Dutch-Australian relationship reveals a picture of pettiness, mutual suspicion, national rivalries, and obstructionism. That would seem to suit to wartime enemies than allies. So that's a very harsh judgment, but it's not around. It's not a blame, and it's not condemning the good work and positive activities that came out of the Dutch East Indies government in exile in Brisbane. But it's to be honest about, I suppose, the difficulties for the Dutch as much for anyone, in terms of the decisions that were made around strategy and foreign affairs. So, my first run at a conclusion is that for further research, we really do need to look at those foreign affairs decisions, particularly around Evatt, and Jack's point was that, I'm just going to skip. Jack's point was that Evatt, there was a conflict between the agendas, and Evatt was an Australian nationalist, and so that the attentions were drawn out and affected, I would imagine, well, Jack, I think, made some references to the Dutch operations and how that might have been affected. Okay, I'm just going to go in terms between my thinking in intellectual history and Jack's thinking in terms of the book, where, you know, the first point is that there's unequal political power. Second is that cooperation mostly was technical with veneer policy talk. The British were largely out of the picture. This is something perhaps is can be debated, because I'm not 100% certain on this, but this is certainly something that a point that Jack raises in terms of how much the Dutch resources were appreciated. Certainly the Australian position was not as secure as the Americans, obviously, and it was fairly jittery. Maybe this is being put in very strong language, but it's something that can be debated. But certainly the narrative that Australians have in their history is that MacArthur was very, very firm and perhaps controlling in terms of the relationships in the Allies cooperation. So there was never a uniform policy, and that's really my conclusion. And you're all very silent, so I hope I haven't stepped on too many toes.